Hello and welcome to the Supercharge Your Sales Velocity podcast, the show where I help you drive more opportunities, bigger deals and faster wins. I'm your host, Fergal O'Carroll, and today's guest brings something truly different to the table and the stage. Bill Conry has 16 years of experience in sales enablement, management and training. He's held roles at Gartner, LinkedIn and Challenger, and he now helps people unlock charisma and confidence through stand-up comedy. That's right. He's blended years of sales experience with live comedy experience to teach teams how to present, pitch and connect with real impact. Now, he's trained professionals in over 20 countries. He's been formed in 14, and he now runs Corporate Charisma, showing people how to communicate with authenticity, energy, and humor. So we're going to explore how laughter can actually accelerate pipeline, build trust, and make your message unforgettable. Bill, it's great to have you on the show.
Hi, Virgil. Great to see you.
So, Bill, listen, you've had a really interesting career journey. You've started off in the corporate world. I know you worked for LinkedIn and Gartner and so on, then stand-up comedian, and now you've got your own business. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start from the top. So in the corporate world for, I don't know, 15 years, something like that. Time flies. And I saw this opportunity. I have a passion for stand-up comedy. I started performing when I moved here to Ireland. And just as a kind of a fun side gig when I worked at LinkedIn, I ran some workshops on how to use humor at work and not get fired. I also ran some workshops on how to create engaging learning experiences that combine some of the humor at work, some other principles of stand-up comedy. And it was just in the back of my mind, maybe I could start a business that kind of bottles some of these best practices. So how stand-up comedians engage an audience on stage, how you can use that in the corporate world. Because it turns out it's actually very transferable skills. How do you present? How do you tell a story? How do you enunciate and use vocal variety and start off a stand-up set or start off a corporate PowerPoint presentation? So I had this dream. A dream might be lofty. I had this idea, I should say. And during COVID, I was kind of reflecting on what do I want to do? And I just had this in the back of my mind. I wind up leaving LinkedIn. I'm doing a lot of contract work. I work with Challenger, do some other projects in the sales enablement, sales facilitating space. And I met up with another stand-up comedian. He's a professional stand-up comedian here in Ireland, Brian Gallagher. He's the resident MC of the Laughter Lounge. It's the biggest comedy club in Ireland. And it turns out he was doing something similar for schools. It was running workshops on public speaking and stand-up comedy and confidence building. And I said, what if we combine forces and we took kind of the best of what you've done, the best of what I've done. We maybe come up with some additional ideas as well, and we target corporates. And the rest was history. So we started a business called Corporate Charisma about 3 years ago. It took us a long time to actually come up with the name and the logo and the website. But I think the one takeaway was perfection is the enemy of progress. And I think that was definitely true. We will not be in a case study for how to start a business quickly and efficiently.
Sometimes good is good enough, right? And you just got to move on. You're not going to get perfect. Listen, I'm curious, just as you were talking there about the switch, when did you actually first do stand-up? I mean, what was that like, that very first time on stage? Because I can only imagine it must be petrifying.
Yeah, so I did a comedy class when I moved to Ireland, and you have an instructor, and you're working through material for 6 or 7 weeks, and there's like a friends and family show. So that went fine, but it's like a very welcoming audience.
So it's a warm
And
audience,
actually,
right? They
it's
all
a warm
want to
audience.
clap and laugh. Okay.
So I don't have a very good story about that, but I do have a good story. So after that, so after we do the course and you have, a controlled environment, you're on your own. You have to hustle to get gigs. And I got my first booked gig here in Dublin. It was at a place called the Halfpenny Bridge Inn. Still there in Temple Bar. It's a classic kind of touristy pub. And they had a show called The Battle of the Axe, which in retrospect was kind of an open mic. It was a booked show, but they essentially let anybody on stage. I thought it was like this super prestigious show to get on. I was super nervous. And someone from the class was like, wow, you're on The Battle of the Axe. You should bring every person you know in Ireland just to support you, because that's like a big stage to get on. At the time, like I moved to Ireland only 6 months ago. I had a group of friends that also moved here. So it was easy to kind of round people up. So I wound up bringing 20 people to this show. There are maybe 24 people in the audience. So pretty much everybody, and the show's like way more casual than I thought. I was embarrassed at how many people I brought. And the other comedians and the hosts were like, these people are all here for you. And they're all making jokes throughout, like, I'm starting a cult and like, how do I have all these friends and stuff? And the MC wound up having me headline. Like I was supposed to go sometime in the second half, and just so I guess my friends didn't leave, he's like, "Why don't you go on last?" So it was a great experience. I think I only did so well because I had so many friends there. And actually, a funny story about that: the MC, his name's Damian Clark. He started the Crackdown Comedy Club, which is one of the biggest comedy clubs in the country now. He gave me the lineup, like the roster card, as a memento, and I still have it in a drawer here. And I saw it just a few months ago. Two of the comedians on stage that night that essentially opened for me are super big now. Like they're like touring. One just booked a show at Vicker Street, like sold out theaters. And I can say that I had no idea who anybody was at the time. That I can say now that these two big comedians opened for me on my
Open
very
for
first show.
you. You
Yeah,
headlined. Yeah, I love it.
yeah. But then after that, it was kind of a rude awakening that if you don't have all of your friends in the audience, you have to actually do well. And I was
Yeah.
super nervous my first several times on stage.
I can remember going back, and it's going back decades now, my first time standing in front of a business, this is in the business context, just did a very small presentation. I think I was probably 20, and I'd never done anything like this, and I was almost shaken with the kind of nervous energy. I was just afraid, I suppose, because it was the first time of doing this, and that stayed with me for quite a long time. And over the years, I think maybe just as getting older, I wouldn't say there was any particular training, but just over time, I got a bit more relaxed about standing in front of people. But I know there's a lot of people in business today who are still, I would say, locked into a little bit of fear. And I actually think it's probably holding their careers back. And I'm guessing corporate charisma is a help to that, right? You're looking to help people who may not be natural in front. I'll call it an audience, but I mean, we're probably talking in the sales environment here, so it's more like prospects, customers, internal meetings, that type of thing. Get into a little more detail about corporate charisma and the type of help that you can provide.
Yeah. So absolutely. And that was one of the main reasons why I was inspired to start this business, because I think communication skills, public speaking skills, at least exuding confidence when you present is critical to success. You can't think of any CEO or top manager or executive director that doesn't have at least the requisite public speaking skills. It really makes a huge difference. And I saw this firsthand that it's holding people back. When I went to grad school, I went to business school part time at UC Berkeley when I lived in San Francisco. We had to take a communication course. It's called Leadership Communications. So it's kind of on public speaking and being authentic and telling your story. And there was a lot of people in the class that were very successful engineers, product managers at big tech companies. A lot of them didn't speak English as their native language. And I found that they had brilliant ideas, but they weren't always able to express themselves. And maybe it was harder for them to get others on board or for people to listen to them because they just didn't communicate their thoughts articulately. So I saw it firsthand, it was holding people back. And I also saw after that class that really helped people with their confidence and helped with some of the tactics to actually present. I saw some people break out of their shell that were very introverted, shy, not a skilled public presenter. They were more successful in the program. I could see that they were just more confident and they were speaking up more, and I'm sure it helped them with their career. So I think that is absolutely part of why we exist and where there's an opportunity. I think no matter who you are and what you do, public speaking skills, communication skills are paramount to success. So whether you are an entry level engineer and you want to get that next promotion and you need to communicate more effectively and maybe convince internal stakeholders of your ideas, this is critically important. Also, if you are a mid-level manager, you're in sales and maybe you're an okay public speaker, but you want to go to that next level, I think you could also benefit. So what I think is interesting is when we started this business, we thought sales is probably our best market. And it probably continues to be the most consistent for us. But there's also a lot of opportunity for maybe entry level employees in any role, for leaders that need to be more authentic with their teams when they communicate, for more technical teams. We did a great workshop in Toronto with a tech company, the insights team. So they look at all these complex insights on consumers, and then they have to convey those insights to customers and internal stakeholders. Very good with data, very good at technical solutions. They really need improvement in their storytelling. How do you tell an engaging story? How do you get others on board? So I think the more that we do this, every time me and Brian talk, we think, oh, we have our target market. This is our best audience. We might find another audience that could benefit even more.
I just picked up on the word technical, because in my role as a salesperson, and I have been in IT software sales, and I've had a tech team around me, and those technical people, very good at the technical aspects, but tended to struggle a bit in front of the client. Depending, not every individual, but some did. And in fact, I can remember we got a bit of training actually on, I won't call it public speaking, it was more about presentation skills, I think. One of the exercises, we went around the room, we were asked to stand up and talk just for about 2 minutes. Can't remember what the topic was. But the tech guy stood up and he said, I can't talk without slides. He just said, I can't talk. He said, I have never actually stood up in front of an audience without pointing at a slide, because in his technical world, it was always, let's bring up the slide with whatever techie stuff he was trying to show us. And I just thought it was amusing. We all had a bit of a laugh about it, right? And of course, the instructor said, well, now's your first time. You're going to talk to us for 2 minutes without slides. And he was crumbling, he really struggled. So I suppose what I'm saying is we use a crutch there, don't we? We use we use that slide, we always grab onto the slide as our crutch so that we can just keep pointing at that. I'm hopeful you're going to tell me that there's a technique that we don't have to hang on to the slides as a crutch. What is it?
To the contrary, that's actually what we teach. We tell everyone, just read a PowerPoint slide top to bottom. The more text, the better.
The more text, the better, yeah. And 20 bullet points per slide, right?
I think, Fergal, that a lot of people are in that boat. They need a slide to speak. They can't think independently, or they don't want to.
Why is that? What's in our brains that makes that happen?
There's probably a lot of things. So one thing is, I think people are afraid that they're going to forget their words, or they're going to just mess up. They're going to misspeak. They're going to maybe stumble through a pronunciation.
So say the wrong thing, or just forget what you're going to say.
Yeah, exactly. But the good news is that people can have all the fear in the world of they're going to mess up this presentation. Even if you do mess something up, 9 times out of 10, the audience doesn't know, or they don't care. There's something called the spotlight bias, where we think there's essentially a spotlight on us, and the whole world is scrutinizing our every action. You walk out of the house and your fly was down that day, you think everyone must have noticed. The reality is, most people didn't notice. They're too busy thinking about themselves. And if they did notice, they quickly forgot about it. They don't care. So we tell our clients to be aware of this. Like, what is the absolute worst that can happen? You go blank on stage and you make a joke about it. You say, I can't remember, what was I talking about? Oh, yes. If anything, it shows that you're more authentic, you're more relatable. So I think we have this big fear that, like, what is going to go wrong if I misspeak, or if I stumble through this slide, I say something inaccurate, the audience will never forgive me, or they're never going to forget that. But think about it. Like, you've probably been to many presentations where maybe something goes awry. You forget about it quickly. If anything, it maybe makes it more memorable and more interesting. I think some of those fears are just not valid, but that is how most people think. That it's just wired into their brain that everything needs to be perfect.
Maybe, Bill, it's going back to that perfect is the enemy of good. We're trying our best to give probably perfect presentations, word perfect presentations, when in actual fact, the audience is A, not expecting that, and B, when you don't deliver that, they don't notice anyway. So we're setting these expectations in our head that are giving us the nerves and so forth. Talk to me a bit about practice, because personally, what calms me down in front of an audience, if I'm given, say, a fairly lengthy presentation, what helps me calm is just that I'm prepared. I've spent the time looking through. If it's a deck, I've looked through the deck. And even if the deck went blank for a minute or two, I could probably talk to the slides anyway and move on. I'm not hanging on to the slide, but that only comes through a lot of prep. Is that a big part of what we need to do?
Prep is important, but how you prep is even more important. I think too often people prep where they're not mimicking the actual situation they're going to be in. So for instance, maybe this is something, in fact, I do this. You might be prepping for a presentation. I'm just sitting down at my laptop like this, and I have the speaker notes and PowerPoint in front of me. Great, that's a nice crutch. But when I take the stage, I'm not going to have the speaker notes. So that's not very good prep.
Can I jump in there with a story? I was prepping for, it was a virtual meeting. It was a prep for a virtual meeting. And I use Google Meet as my software, but the client was using something different. I think it was Teams or something like that. So to your point, I said, no, I need to prep with exactly the tech that I'm going to use on the day. Now, I had been doing a little bit of prep with my own software, which was all fine. Started to use the team software. And when I share the screen and I move my mouse to a certain point in the screen, I notice that Teams has this button that's right over where I need to be, where I need to click my video on. And instead of me moving my video on, it clicks, it does something on the screen. So to your point, if I hadn't prepped that on in the meeting, I'd have been, oh my god, what's going on here? So please carry on, because I think it's such an interesting method.
And I've had something similar facilitating on Zoom versus Microsoft Teams. I'm normally on Zoom, and I think just the configuration and like being able to use two monitors was different on Teams. And one time I was doing a new workshop is with Challenger. I had to look at my notes, and the way that Teams was configured, I couldn't see my notes, and it was going to be too difficult to try to fix it. So I just had to kind of wing it just by looking at the notes. So yes, definitely prep in the program that you're actually going to be using. Try to mimic it. If it's a virtual presentation, I recommend you actually do have Zoom or Teams or whatever open so that you're mimicking the actual environment. If you're using two monitors, do that. So more broadly, try to mimic the actual situation that you'll be in. But what I like to do for speaking in general, instead of trying to memorize every slide, it's the same technique for remembering your stand-up bit. Remember just the gist of it. So for slide one, this is the intro. Slide two, I talk about this concept. Slide three, I give an example. If you try to remember too much information, so I'm going to talk about this. If you're basically thinking sentences and paragraphs instead of big concepts, you're probably going to get tripped up, because if you forget sentence one, you need the cue of sentence one to get to sentence two. You could throw everything off. If you are trying to memorize word for word or two specific details, I think it's going to come back to haunt you, versus if you just understand the gist. So the big point of this slide is that, I don't know, pollution is a problem. You can kind of riff off of that. If you get thrown off, you remember the main point of that slide. In terms of like designing the slides, you of course don't want to be reading the slides. We recommend you don't have too much text. I actually think less text is better. Having just a picture, I think, is ideal. But one little hack, one little cheat is like maybe you could have a couple bullets or a couple words or phrases that will trigger your memory. So maybe, there's just a couple bullets written on that page. It's not very detailed, but if you do get thrown off, you will remember based on what you have written. There's one other technique. This is kind of more advanced, and my partner Brian lives by this. He speaks about it all the time. Candidly, I rarely use it, but I think it's an interesting concept that most of our clients like. It's called the memory palace. Have you heard of the memory palace?
I haven't, no.
So we did not create this. In fact, I think it's been around for thousands of years, and is the primary technique and variations of it that are used in international memory competitions. Like people that have to memorize 5 playing card decks in order, they use the memory palace. So the gist of it is, imagine a place you know very well, your childhood home, your current apartment, something like that. One example is if you have to remember a grocery list, you envision yourself walking through that house. So you're walking in through the hallway, and there is milk spilled in the center hallway. Then you go into the kitchen, and there's cracked eggs on the ceiling. Then you go into the bathroom, and there's, I don't know, orange juice in the toilet bowl. So you're placing these items in each of these rooms. So you know the room by heart, you know the structure of the house by heart. You're trying to just kind of trigger your memory. So when you're in the kitchen, you see these eggs. So then you're at the grocery store, you just have to envision walking through that house, and you're remembering all of these items.
Even as you're talking, I'm remembering what you're saying, because I'm visualizing the going into the
Yeah.
hallway and the kitchen and so on. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So the idea, like the whole idea is, I guess, like how our mind works. If you can take something you know by heart and kind of link it to something you're trying to remember, especially if you make it more visual, that's how you can do this. When I was at the Edinburgh Fringe Fest it's a big comedy and arts festival in Edinburgh every year. There's a guy who does these like memory feats, and he did some other interesting kind of like magic tricks. He memorized the playing card deck in like 30 seconds, like in order. And he told us how he did it. And it was a variation of this. Like, so he imagines walking down his childhood street, and there's like a mailbox and a driveway and like a yard where he puts every playing card, and he has like a story, like a character attached to each playing card. The king of spades is, his mother's friend Lucy, and whatever it is. So again, like you can do variations of this. So all this is to say, so all this is probably sounding very complicated to the listener. If you're practicing a presentation, you could imagine for each section of the presentation or the speech, practice it in different rooms in your house. So the intro is in your living room. The first paragraph is in the kitchen. Then you go into the bedroom. So if you think that if you're off, if the PowerPoint goes out, you could just imagine walking through your house and you're linking those sections of the presentation to the rooms in your house. So you get used to kind of like this flow. And then, oh, where was I? I was in the hallway. Then I'm going to transition into the bathroom. And the bathroom is this section on, whatever topic 4 was. Yeah, so it's a technique. There's all these different variations. Whatever works for you. We share that in our workshops often, and a handful of people have said that they actually use that just for kind of simple presentations,
Yeah, I can
walking
imagine
room to
it's not
room.
for everybody, right? I
It's
think some
not. It
people will
is
warm to it.
totally,
So there's, yeah, okay.
totally. Yeah, but it's an interesting technique. Yeah.
Probably like yourself, I've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of sales presentations. Vast majority are very boring. Why are they very boring? Why do you think so?
Well, for a bunch of reasons. How much time do you have?
We've another 30 minutes at least.
Well, I think there's 2 components. There's what are you presenting, and there's how are you presenting it.
To be fair, the topic can often be a bit dull, particularly
Exactly.
if it's IT software sales. It can be quite dull. So carry on.
Definitely. But the good news is that there's a way to make even a dull topic more interesting, more engaging. One recommendation that we offer, we do practice on this and examples in our workshops. It's starting with what's called a cold open. So a typical sales presentation, how does it start, Fergal? Welcome, my name is Fergal. I'm going to present so-and-so. Here's an agenda.
Yeah, guilty. Done that.
Yeah, some housekeeping. It's exactly how every other presentation in the world, every sales presentation starts. Right off the bat, you are communicating to the audience, this is going to be a generic, boring 30 minutes. They're already tuning out. So one way that you could combat that is you do something different. You break the mold. And we call it a cold open. We didn't invent this technique. It's often used in television and in film. But you start with something more interesting. So maybe it's a question right off the bat. Show of hands, how confident are you in your IT security? Maybe it's a statistic. Maybe you're telling a story. Maybe it's a joke. But you start in some way that breaks the mold. It doesn't have to be overly engineered, overly theatrical. You don't have to come in tap dancing or anything like that. But it's just a question. It's a story. It's a statistic. It's maybe a joke that catches them off guard. Ideally, it involves the audience right away. And I think that this technique really pays dividends throughout the presentation because you've already set the tone that this is something different. This is something a little bit more interesting. Because I think the first 30 seconds of any stand-up comedy set, any presentation, really is going to impact the engagement of the rest of that set or the rest of that presentation. So the cold open is one good technique. I think another thing is that a lot of times it's just a one-way conversation. I think presentations in general, especially sales presentations, it's like a monologue. Some of the questions that are asked are just closed-ended. Like, does this make sense? It's not really giving the audience an opportunity to participate. So my recommendation is to involve them. Maybe you're asking more in-depth questions, more open-ended questions. Maybe there's more polls. If you're on Zoom or Microsoft Teams, you can often have like a quick poll to see, how do people feel about this, or use the chat, in input this. So try to involve the audience a little bit more. There could even be, I don't know, some competition or something. You can make it as elaborate as you'd like. Another thing that a lot of people do or don't do, I should say, is they use just monotone voice, and it makes such a big difference. Monotone voice, you know what that is, but vocal variety is where people don't put enough thought into how they are speaking. So when I say vocal variety, I mean the pace, the pitch, the tone, the volume. If you're talking about something more serious, you might want to lower your voice and speak a little bit slower. If you want to get them excited, you have to change the intonation, the inflection of your voice. Most people do this naturally, but they don't do it enough. They don't do it consistently enough. So you could be a little bit more thoughtful about that. And then the last thing, as we were talking about earlier, is involve stories. There's probably a lot of information to share, a lot of data. I imagine for most software sales, it's very technical, very rational. And one way to make this a little bit more interesting, a little bit more engaging, is to make it more emotional. So give an example of someone using your software, talking about people, talking about the impact, something that really evokes emotion. Tell a story that has maybe a twist in it. It has characters that are relatable. There's some sort of outcome. You want them to be kind of engaged and intrigued. It doesn't have to be some, Pixar nominated story that you're telling, but just a story that kind of brings some of the information to light, I think goes a long way.
There's so much in there, right? So much in so many insights. Let's go back to the cold open because I can remember being at a Gartner conference, and I know you've worked at Gartner. And I think it was the first time I'd noticed something like a cold open when I went into this particular presentation, and it was a very large room. There's hundreds of people in the room, and the presenter got on stage, did not introduce himself whatsoever. I can't even remember if there was a slide on the screen. It probably wasn't. So blank screen. And stood up and just started off. And I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like, 47%. And then he gave some rationale behind the number. And he probably talked for about 2 minutes. And he had the whole room were listening to what he said. And it was only after that couple of minutes did he introduce himself, the topic of the presentation, and then he kind of moved on. And I just thought, wow, that was really powerful. And it was just so subtle because if he'd stood up and said, I'm so and so, this is what we're going to do today, everybody's reaching for their phones, they're checking a few emails, they're waiting for the thing to get going, where he bypassed that completely. So I totally buy into what you said there.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, I mean, we're not the only ones that teach this, and yeah, I worked at Gartner. There's some fantastic speakers there, so I'm not surprised. But just think about the novelty of it. You're an audience member. You're intrigued. Where is this going? We like surprises. We like things that are different, things that are unexpected. So it's going to create this novel experience, and it's going to really just capture your attention. And I want to stress when I share this in our workshops. And we start with a more elaborate cold open. We do kind of like a game right off the bat. I stress it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be overly dramatic, but it could just be a stat. You share this stat for 45 seconds and then you introduce yourself. And it just captures that attention right off the bat.
Talk to me about a sales manager holding a sales team meeting. They probably do it maybe once a week, maybe it's once a month, whatever it might be. Any advice there for a sales manager and how they might mix it up month to month? Because they're probably repeating a very similar pattern in those sales teams meetings. It could be, we start off with some results. We talk a bit about our pipeline. Maybe we get into some activity, a couple of deals we've won, a couple of deals we've lost. And after month 4 or 5, it starts to get maybe a little monotonous. People are not getting a lot of value. Any suggestions on how they might mix it up?
Yeah, sure. I'd imagine people, because they're so consistent, because it's kind of the same agenda week after week, and maybe they have a better forecast week 3 versus week 4, but it's mostly the same stuff. People probably are naturally tuning out. They're going on autopilot. I'd imagine if it's virtual, they might be multitasking. So a couple ways to mix it up. The manager could do a activity, do a cold open, tell a story. I think if they do literally anything different, it doesn't even have to be at the start with the cold open. If there's anything different, it's going to capture attention. I'd imagine the team would be kind of relieved if there's a different section on, I don't know, customer value, or you have like a guest speaker. Anything different probably will really stand out because they're so used to the consistency. And I think one practical way, and I've seen this on sales teams I've been a part of, you have guest hosts. So you have a rep, you take turns, and maybe they have some discretion, like they could, the first 10 minutes is a wild card topic. They can talk about anything. Maybe it's a learning corner, learning session, or something like that. So I think just finding ways, maybe through the variety of who is speaking and the activities that you do, just find ways to mix it up. It doesn't all have to be on the manager.
No, and I think sometimes the manager takes that on board as it's all down to them to essentially craft, design, deliver this meeting, whether it's once a week or whatever. And that can be a bit pressing because you've got so many other tasks to do. And then you end up kind of running into that meeting without any real prep. And then it just becomes a pretty dull sales meeting.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And another tip also is if there's nothing big to report, there's no major swings in the forecast, cancel the meeting. A lot of companies, a lot of sales managers need to hear this. I think some companies just have this culture of meetings. We have this forecast call once a week. We have this check-in. We have this one-on-one once a week. I think if there isn't necessarily a need for it, if there's nothing new, nothing interesting, nothing that couldn't be an email, perhaps you just don't have the meeting. And I think most people are happy with that.
I think there's nothing more joyful than 5 minutes into a meeting, somebody says, "Do you know what? I think we're done here. I'll give you back half
I
an
love
hour
that.
or
Yeah.
there."
You appreciate that time. And I've
Don't you
I've
really?
learned from running workshops and trainings, you can always, every time you let people out early, they love
Yeah,
that.
they
An
absolutely
extra
do.
20 minutes on the calendar, they love it. But you can't let them out late. You can't keep people another 30 minutes. There's going to be a
Yeah,
revolt.
it's
Yeah.
almost the opposite. Tell me this: I'm giving two speeches in July at a conference, and it's essentially, I suppose, you could call it public speaking. It's not a list of prospects, really. It's an audience who are looking to be educated. In my case, it's around using AI and how you use it to make yourself more efficient and maximize your time selling. Could you give me a couple of nuggets of wisdom as to how I might go about improving? Now, you haven't seen my presentation, you don't know what I'm actually presenting on, but just so generally speaking, if someone's in my position, what would your advice
Mhm.
be to them?
So to recap, the presentation is on how to use AI, and who is the audience?
So the audience is actually an audience that I'm not familiar with. They're in the electromechanical service industry. So I literally know zero about their industry. So they're salespeople in that industry. So we'll say the audience is salespeople.
Okay, so one thing is know your audience. That kind of goes without saying, but I think you can capitalize on that. So think about what does everybody in the room have in common? They are all salespeople. Are they all
Yes.
in Ireland?
They're global. They'll be traveling to the US for a global conference.
Oh, it's in the US. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So they're all in the same industry. So if there is a story, if there's even a joke that maybe everyone can relate to, you can capitalize on that. In stand-up comedy, it's really nice if you have a consistent audience. When I do gigs in Kilkenny, it is 100% Irish. I know exactly what jokes to make, exactly what references I can share. I know what they're going to get. If I'm doing a gig in Temple Bar, it's probably 60, 70% tourists from all over. It's kind of a wild card. Can I tell this joke about Irish counties? Are they going to know this UK celebrity? So there is something that you can capitalize on. If there is this consistency, everyone's in the same industry, they're all in sales, just have that in the back of your mind for any stories you tell, jokes to tell, etc. But I think more practically speaking, you said the presentation is on AI. I'm wondering if you could do some sort of like a demonstration. Maybe it's with a volunteer, maybe everyone like takes out their phone and like types something into ChatGPT. I don't know exactly what you're trying to prove, but I think that this, just considering that it's AI, I'd imagine there's an opportunity to do some sort of activity. It could be something super simple. Maybe everyone asks the same question to ChatGPT and you see like the variation of,
On
of
the different
answers.
answers.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure. Yeah. Another thing, like, so actually, if you can't, if maybe that's a little bit too clunky, have you used a Slido? And there's a couple other similar programs
I
like
was
that.
considering that because I have used it once and I quite liked it. So it's a nice way to interact with the audience.
Yeah, because it's like it doesn't have to be like the most groundbreaking, interesting questions you're asking, but asking like a quick poll on how advanced do you think AI will become by 2030? It could be questions that have a factual answer, or you're just trying to get their opinion. I think it involves them right away. You can use that information in your presentation. Oh, 30% of the people in the room think this. I think also tell some stories. So you could tell stories on the application, on the topic. Don't make it too technical. I might have a bias here, but hear me out. Incorporate some jokes. Now, you don't have to be a professional comedian to do this. What we find is there's a low bar for humor in the workplace or at a corporate event. They're probably not expecting many jokes. They will appreciate even just the effort. It could be some corny dad joke. It could be a joke from ChatGPT. Actually, you can maybe that could help prove your point. You make a joke, and if it goes well, you take credit for it. If it doesn't go well, say, "Oh, actually, I got that joke from ChatGPT."
Or I got that from Bill Conry.
Yeah, you give me credit.
Yeah.
Only if it goes well. Just the attempt at humor, showing that you don't take yourself too seriously, it creates more of a laid back atmosphere. You can laugh at yourself. You're giving them permission to laugh. So I think it keeps things more light. It also is a great tactic for engagement. People are paying attention when they're laughing. So try to script in a couple interesting jokes.
There's gold in there for sure. And some of those I've been thinking about, but some I hadn't. So thank you for that. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a selfish question there.
Yeah, no worries. No,
Bit of
my
private
pleasure.
coaching. Talk to me about authenticity in selling because you talk about being a confident, engaging communicator. And yet The sales world is being filled with sales scripts. We've got AI automation coming in. You're starting to see AI generated emails and so forth, and they lack authenticity, right? We need to pull back a little bit, don't we? We need to start thinking more about how we communicate with people. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So I'm also going to relate this to stand-up comedy. People can tell when you are not being authentic. If you're trying to be a different persona on stage than you actually are, if you're trying to be a different person in the sales meeting than you actually are, the customers can tell. I guess they don't really believe you. They're less likely to believe you. So I think authenticity is key. You look at who you are as a person, how people perceive you, and really emphasize that. If you're a little bit nerdy, maybe you have high energy, take advantage of that. Try to take like the good attributes that come with that. At the end of the day, people buy from people. They want to believe the person, they want to trust the person. And I totally agree with you. In the era of AI written emails and AI generated scripts, and I know a lot of companies just kind of blast out a sales script that everyone should use. I think that customers can tell if somebody's being authentic. So I would double down on just who are you? How do you naturally communicate? And try to emphasize that in your communications with customers.
I'm working with a colleague in the US. We're working on some really interesting projects around AI, and sales messaging is part of the offering. And we're really focused on educating people to use AI as an assistant, not a replacement, and never do that copy and paste. So anything you generate with AI is an assistant, and then you need to take it to the next couple of levels before you release it. And I'm fearful that people aren't doing that, but I'm also hopeful that over time people will realize, because when they're on the receiving end of that AI generated poor quality output, that they'll realize why they need to take it to personalize it.
It's a great way to start, but you should personalize it beyond that. I use AI for the first time for a LinkedIn post. I typed it away. I did it myself, the first draft. And I thought, oh, why don't I see if AI can make this better? There's one section that I thought was a little bit clunky. ChatGPT did a beautiful job. However, it was way too eloquent for how I actually speak. I
Yeah,
think
it's not
anyone that
you.
knows
Yeah.
me, I don't post a ton on LinkedIn, but I think
Yeah.
anyone could see right through this. So I guess I had to kind of take it back a little bit. In fact, I think I actually had ChatGPT and like, can you do it again? But this middle paragraph was like a little bit too intelligent for me. I struck a good balance. It was a good use of AI to give me some ideas, but then I was the one that finalized it.
Exactly that. Just maybe riffing on the stand up aspect of your experience, I'm guessing that you've had the odd occasion where you might have bombed on
Never.
stage. Never?
No,
No,
of
okay.
course. No, of course. Yeah.
Well, we'll do it hypothetical then. If you apply it to a salesperson, right? An example could be I'm making a presentation to a really important prospect. It's a really important meeting. I've got some of my team with me. We've done a lot of prep. But then there's a person on the client or the prospect side who starts asking these really awkward questions, interrupting your flow, interrupting your thought process, putting a lot of objections that you haven't really prepared for, and you're starting to stumble. And sometimes it's a domino effect and you just never recover. And I suppose I'm wondering, in the stand-up world, you've gone on stage and you've got your set prepared and you think you know the audience, and then all of a sudden something happens and the whole gig starts to fall apart and you're unable to kind of react in real time and your gig is a disaster. So I'm curious, have you got a correlation between the stand-up world and that business meeting I was talking about?
Yeah, yeah. So you could bomb both in the corporate boardroom or in the comedy club. So in the moment, it could be terrifying. And any comedian that says they haven't bombed is lying. Even the most professional comedians, I've seen famous comedians test material and go down like a lead balloon. You're never going to have all gold come out of your mouth. But I think one technique that a lot of comedians use when they're bombing, or if just an individual joke bombs, is they acknowledge it. They say, that was the first time sharing that joke and also the last time, or that joke landed better with the test audience, or that joke killed back in Ireland or in the US. You kind of acknowledge it and you move on. Normally that gets a laugh, but you can only use that technique once. You can't
Right.
you
I
can't you
keep
say
using
you can't
it.
do it throughout your set. You kind of lose some credibility. In the sales world, if you're bombing, I think it depends on the actual situation. But for instance, if you maybe don't answer a question well, or you're clearly rattled, or you lose your train of thought, you could call it out. You could say, oh, sorry, you know what? I lost my train of thought here, or I got a little bit confused. Could you repeat your question? We have this incentive to always chime in with the answer and not be vulnerable, not share, not say I don't know. I think back to the idea of authenticity. Customers appreciate it when you are just honest. Well, you say I don't know, or you acknowledge I didn't answer that correctly, or I think I could have been more clear in my answer. Even if you don't have a better answer, I think just being honest about it, that goes a long way. A sign that someone is intelligent and confident is that they say, I don't know. They admit when they don't know the answer. Another technique that I just thought of, it's our natural tendency, I think, especially salespeople, they want to immediately interject with the answer. They're asked a question, they might immediately launch into an answer. And sometimes they might be stalling. Same thing with comedy. If you're doing crowd work, that's when you engage with the audience. A lot of new comedians, they think immediately when someone says, I'm a lawyer, you have to have a joke. You can take a step back. You can kind of pause. You could think. You could ask a follow-up question. You don't have to immediately launch into a joke, something funny on the comedy stage, or the factual answer in a sales presentation. You can just kind of take a step back. Yeah.
You're given an objection. You don't have to immediately try and answer the objection. It could be, could you tell me a little bit about more? Did I understand you right? Is this what you mean? Yeah.
To clarify that you actually understand the right question, but also gives you some time to actually think. We have this natural tendency to want to, immediately share our answer, even if it's maybe not really thought out. So I think you have more time than you think. One technique that I talk about this both in my sales training workshops and in my public speaking workshops, it's the concept of pausing or the technique of pausing. You get the point. But the lack of speaking creates engagement. So if they ask you a question and you take a beat, or maybe you ask a question to the audience or to the customer, and then just let it linger, even if they don't respond, they pay more attention. Just psychologically, our minds are wired to pay more attention when there's silence. And it's a technique some of the best public speakers use. So I think the same principle applies here. You could build up more engagements, more suspense, if you will, just by pausing, thinking about it, and then launching into your answer.
Bill, we've had so many insights there in such a short time. It's been fantastic talking to you. Could you tell us where can we find more about your business, about more Bill Conry? Where can people go?
Of course. Our website is corporatecharisma.co, not .com. .com is too expensive. .co. You can find us on LinkedIn as well, Corporate Charisma. You can find me on LinkedIn, Bill Conry. I post on LinkedIn. I'm trying to post more about the intersection of really what we're talking about public speaking, comedy, sales. I travel the world facilitating workshops. I try to share some of my experiences. So follow along for that. If you want to see more of my comedy clips, you can check me out at bcon101 on Instagram. I also share when I have upcoming shows as well.
Terrific. We're going to get all those in the show notes. Bill, thanks again. Lovely talking to you. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Thank you, Fergal. It was a pleasure.